Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Press Club for today's National Australia Bank Address, the first of two addresses at the club this week. Now, while the primary political focus over the past fortnight has obviously been on the federal budget, immigration, or perhaps more to the point, Australia's border protection and asylum seeker policy has certainly received more than its fair share of attention, most recently, of course, in the wake of the release of the report into the Manus Island riots. Well, today our guest is the Shadow Minister for Immigration and Border Protection, Richard Marles. Mr Marles is a former Parliamentary Secretary for both Foreign Affairs and Pacific Island Affairs, and he's also served as a Minister for Trade in the second Rudd government. To discuss the values that drive modern Labor's immigration approach and no doubt some other issues around border protection, would you please welcome the Shadow Minister, Richard Marles.
Well, thanks, Laurie, for that introduction. I can think of no more complex, vexed policy area than that of asylum seekers. It draws strong emotions from the community, and since taking this portfolio, I've learnt a surprising number of obscenities can actually be squeezed into 140 characters. And it in turn demands robust answers to complex questions. Answers to the questions that come from facing the cruel reality that some 7 million people are seeking permanent asylum in the world today. The appalling questions of how many people should we resettle? Which people should we resettle? To whom do we say no? And how do we make this devil's choice? You see, the wicked reality which underpins this area of policy is that whether it's Greens, Liberals or Labor, we are all left saying no to millions of worthy who are seeking refuge. Any intelligent observer of it should immediately be wary of the politician who merely offers a simple slogan as a solution. Precisely because of this complexity, if you intend to navigate asylum seeker policy, you better be clear about your values in the process. The boarding of the Tampa in 2001 was a moment of political rupture for our country, and particularly for immigration policy. As the Liberals drove our public debate off a cliff of xenophobia, Labor made a mistake, which was perhaps understandable in the midst of this storm. Our immediate focus was on the unprecedented events unfolding at sea, and in that process, we did not articulate, in my view, the values which underpinned our actions. As we made difficult decisions in government and now take difficult positions in opposition, it's not enough to get the policy settings right. We also need to win the battle of believability. And to do so, we must articulate what it is that we stand for. There is no doubt that the values that drive modern Labor are compassion, fairness and generosity. A fundamental maxim that we as a country should not harm people. Compassion does lead us to seek an end to the loss of life at sea. Fairness leads us to empower the UNHCR in helping us make the choice of who should qualify for our humanitarian program rather than leaving that to people smugglers. And generosity leads us to increase our humanitarian program. And through it all, we must ensure that we never harm people as a form of deterrence. While the policy questions are complex, the politics of boats is crystal clear. We decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come. Former Prime Minister John Howard spoke those words in October 2001 during his election campaign. A few words intended as a rallying call to voters pressing buttons about our sovereignty that signalled the beginning of more than a decade of dog whistling, policy tussling, soul-searching, loss of life and the ugliest side of political cunning. This has been an appalling debate for Australia. People that faced perilous circumstances at home, risking their lives at sea, elicited not compassion, but instead were castigated on our airwaves, in our parliament and on suburban streets, branded as illegals. In the post-September 11 landscape, people were understandably anxious, and the ground was fertile for people's anxieties to be exploited, including by the shock jocks warning of Sharia law coming to a suburb near you. The Liberals had seized upon the worries of the public facing an unknown terror threat and whipped this frenzy into a political tide. We were all the poorer for this. By 2007, the vessels attempting to reach our shores were few. 5 boats arrived in that year. The people smugglers were devoid of technology we have now, still operating in relatively primitive circumstances without easily accessible smartphones and GPS. While our offshore processing centres remained open, only a handful of people were in them. The strong call from the electorate at the 2007 election was to end offshore processing and abolish temporary protection visas. In early 2008, the last refugees left Nauru. There was barely a whimper from the Liberal Party. While no vessels were arriving, and comparatively few did through 2008, the nature of the problem was about to change. 2009 marked a significant change with a spike in the number of people on the move worldwide. This was reflected in a renewed interest by smugglers in getting people to Australia, particularly Afghan Hazaras and Sri Lankans. It is unlikely the Howard government's policy would have been effective in halting the flow given these changing circumstances. People smugglers had learnt they could still market Australia as a destination, albeit one that required a detour at Nauru. Indonesia's concerns with turnbacks meant this was not an active policy in the last days of the Howard government. And the evidence of TPVs has always been that they increase asylum seeker vessels because under a TPV, a boat is the only means possible to effect a family reunion. And so, the next influx of asylum seeker vessels began. From the immediate moment the asylum seeker vessels began to reappear, Labor immediately set about trying to calibrate a solution to stopping them. While it would have been far from a magic fix in stemming this tide of asylum seekers, I believe had we maintained offshore processing, it would have removed any element of incentive. That was the conclusion of the Houston report, which Labor endorsed in 2012. In 2010, we saw the Christmas Island tragedy followed by a period which saw the sea voyage from Java to Christmas Island become the most dangerous journey in pursuit of refuge anywhere in the world. And it raised, in the process, another difficult question. Did Australia have any obligation in relation to the loss of life on our borders? There are many voices in the debate today calling for the closure of Australia's offshore processing. These voices speak from compassion, and I respect them and recognise the humanity that they bring to a terrible debate. But if compassion is our touchstone, I cannot see how Australia does not accept an obligation surrounding this terrible journey. This was an appalling situation and it had to be stopped. Be it the reintroduction of offshore processing or the work of the expert panel chaired by Air Chief Marshal Angus Houston, Labor sought to do all it could to solve the problem. But the most significant proposal was the Malaysian arrangement. With the decision of the High Court, this proposition was put squarely in the hands of the Parliament. And it is at this point that the Coalition's approach to dealing with the question of asylum seeker policy unravels as nothing other than political opportunism. In following a strict order of obstructionism, Scott Morrison denied Labor cooperation at every turn. he ran a joint ticket with the Greens to bring down the Malaysian arrangement. With the Malaysian arrangement needing a lifeline in the Parliament, Tony Abbott was brutal in tossing it aside. A letter to the Prime Minister in which he rebuked her request for bipartisanship with a stinging, "This is your mess, you fix it." Let me be clear about what the Malaysian arrangement would have done. Scott Morrison says that turning back boats at sea has stopped vessels coming to Australia. While the government hasn't told us how many asylum seekers have been turned around since December, based on the numbers of people arriving as reported weekly last year, it can be no more than 200 or 300. The Malaysian arrangement provided for the effective turnaround of 800 people. By Scott Morrison's own logic, we see crudely paraded via a daily scoreboard, it would have solved this problem almost 3 years ago. Yet the Coalition grasped at a multitude of reasons why they were saying no to the Malaysian arrangement. We have seen Scott Morrison and the Liberal Party try and crudely lay at the feet of Labor the tragedy of those who died at sea. The truth is that ruthless people smugglers are to blame for these deaths. But if Mr Morrison is to continue to indulge in his running tally on our borders, then it is important to know that 689 of those deaths at sea occurred after the Coalition rejected the Malaysian arrangement. I cannot point to a more ruthlessly opportunistic exploitation of a terrible situation than what Scott Morrison and the Coalition did in relation to scuttling the Malaysian arrangement. And if we were to believe the concerns he raised at the time about Malaysia, how does that sit with his negotiations now with Cambodia? His hypocrisy is inescapable. The point I draw to all this is that opposition for opportunistic value must not be allowed to permeate this policy area ever again, and it won't under my watch. Unlike our time in power, the Abbott government does now and will continue to have the support of Labor in bringing to an end the flow of asylum seeker vessels to Australia. But that does not mean for a minute that we have written the Coalition a blank cheque. The lasting policy Labor implemented in government was the PNG arrangement. There has been no more important act by an Australian government in reducing the flow of asylum seeker vessels than this. By securing an agreement with the government of PNG to have those persons found to be refugees at the Manus Island detention facility resettled in PNG, Australia was, for the first time, taken off the table as a permanent resettlement destination. Spreading the word through the networks of people smugglers that taking to the sea offers no chance of ever being resettled in Australia is the only effective way to deter people from making this risky journey. Within 2 months, by the time of the election, vessels that had arrived had dropped by 90%, whereas 19 arrived in the week of 19 July last year. By the first week of September, that number was down to 3. And there those numbers stayed until mid-December, despite the government not putting in place a single other piece of substantive policy during that time. But the success of the PNG arrangement should ultimately be measured by the fact that since the day of its implementation, on 19 July last year, 312 days, we have not seen a single loss of life at sea. This is the real daily count that we should note. Today, Labor continues to stand for compassion in doing all that is necessary to bring an end to the loss of life at sea. We support offshore processing at Nauru and Manus Island as a step which has saved lives. But this does not absolve the government from their obligations to ensure that Manus Island is a place which is safe, dignified and humane. Why is that such a hard sentiment for Mr Morrison to express? Why is this such a hard outcome for the Liberal government to implement. The death of Reza Barati in an Australian paid facility is truly shocking. Outbreaks of violence, harm and abuse have no place in detention facilities of which we are a part. It is clear from the Cornell report released yesterday that the government breached its duty of care to those persons at Manus Island. It did so by ignoring the repeated advice to upgrade security, including fencing and lighting. It also did so by neglecting the critical relationship with the Papua New Guinean government. The fact that Scott Morrison hastily convened a ministerial forum only after the tragic violence occurred, 8 months after taking ownership of the facility, is a serious breach of his ministerial responsibility. There still remain unanswered questions about his conduct and response to the repeated warnings he personally received about the need to improve security. Today, Labor stands for fairness by working with bodies such as the UNHCR to determine where best to deploy our humanitarian program for the greatest benefit. As those arriving by sea have filled up the available places in the humanitarian program, the voiceless in this debate are people in camps such as Dadaab in Kenya or Yida in South Sudan, which I visited last year. Languishing in these camps are the world's most vulnerable. Today, Labor also stands for generosity by seeing an increase in the size of our humanitarian program. We are a rich country. We must be doing more. The Abbott government's slashing of the humanitarian program speaks of a mean, selfish streak that permeates much of its immigration policies. By the end of the Labor government, we had increased the humanitarian program to 20,000. That would have increased over the course of our next term had we been re-elected, and that would have been the right thing to do and signalled a system that is fair, compassionate and generous. The government's mean-spirited approach has also played out in Mr Morrison's dogged determination to use temporary protection visas. Let's be clear. Unless TPVs are to be offered to people arriving after the 19th of July last year, which would in itself amount to putting Australia back on the table, their only role will be in relation to the 30,000 asylum seekers who are already in Australia. As such, by definition, TPVs cannot act as a deterrent. TPVs leave those who are on them in limbo. They are costly, they are short-sighted and create a cycle of despair and dependence. Another area of this government's policy which raises concern is the approach it has taken to turnbacks at sea. There is a scant level of information in the public domain to adequately inform us about what is actually occurring. Turning around rickety boats at sea is fraught with danger for our servicemen and women and those aboard the vessels. As such, we remain concerned about safety at sea. But the other critical risk is to our relationship with Indonesia. The clandestine Operation Sovereign Borders is corroding this relationship. There is no more vivid demonstration of this point than the fact it caused the cancellation of a prime ministerial visit to Indonesia which was intended to heal the rift. This is the nonsense of pursuing a policy of regional cooperation from an autocratic standpoint, and a guns-blazing, go-it-alone effort to rule our seas will not work over the long term. We simply must work with Indonesia and our neighbours on this issue. Labor supports a regional solution to this global challenge. The relationship with our neighbours is a significant point of difference between Labor and the Coalition. For where we stand for regional cooperation on asylum seekers with Malaysia and Indonesia, or with PNG and Nauru, the actions of the Abbott government make it abundantly clear that they stand for unilateralism, and this is not sustainable. While there is much work which needs to be done before Labor settles on the precise policy that it will take to the next election, there are some important observations that can be made now. Central to our position will be a continued support for offshore processing and the PNG arrangement. We will also stand for humanity and dignity in the way that that system operates. And Labor will stand for a significant increase in our humanitarian program befitting a wealthy country with a generous heart offering a fair go. One of the collateral impacts of the asylum seeker issue is that it has allowed very little room for talk of anything else in the immigration area. I believe the government has no focus, interest or depth to look beyond the scoreboard of arrivals. Scott Morrison will be typecast as the hard man of our borders, and that may suit him for his future political ambitions. But the immigration space is much more than chest beating on the good days and deathly silence on the bad ones. Below the politics lies a debate about the critical role immigration will play in our future economy, acknowledging the wonderful role that immigration has played in forging contemporary Australia. Bob Hawke once said that the great influx of migrants after the Second World War is the most defining feature of Australia today, and he's right. And so beyond the toxic politics around asylum seekers, we want to have that debate. We want to enliven it. And we want to talk about immigration policy not with fear, but with pride in our past and optimism for our future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Marles. Let's move straight now to questions, our usual round of questions from our media members. The first one today from John Cameron.
Cheers. If I just might ask you, in terms of your commitments after, your post-election commitments, your policy that you will take to the next election, are you actually saying that it will be 20,000, the humanitarian intake? And I guess I also wanted to ask whether you have any plans to revisit the business visa program 457s. There was a pretty vigorous debate on that front before the election as well.
In relation to the size of our humanitarian program, as I said in the speech at the end of government, we were at 20,000. The figure now is 13,750. We do stand for a bigger humanitarian program. Now, we'll have an internal debate over the course of the next few years leading up to what precise number we take to the next election. But you can be certain that what Labor stands for in this sphere is for a larger humanitarian program befitting of values which speak of generosity, and that will be the guiding principle in what we do. In terms of 457s, there is an important debate around 457s in terms of making sure that it plays the important role that it does in filling gaps in our labour market, which actually improves or increases the number of Australian jobs. But at the same time, it's really important that 457 visas are not abused. And that's why in government we put in place a whole lot of measures around labour market testing to just ensure that 457s were used as a tool for building our economy rather than as an industrial tool. And that has been our concern about 457s. But we acknowledge the important role that 457s have to play. But the final point I'd make on that is, at least when we're talking about 457s, we are having a conversation about the role that immigration plays in building our economy. And first and foremost, that's where we think this debate in relation to immigration needs to go.
A question now from Sarah White.
Hi, I'm from the Sydney Morning Herald. The report that was released yesterday did mention a lot about Labor. When Labor was in, there was a lot of issues with the security, the fencing. That came up again, saying that the Liberal government was at fault at not updating that, but Labor didn't either. I'd like to know why didn't Labor update the fencing, but also what's your view, what's your grand view for immigration? You say you support offshore processing. I'd like to know if you came into Parliament tomorrow and you're the immigration minister, what's the first thing you'd do?
Well, in terms of, firstly in relation to the first part of the question around the Manus Island facility. During our time in government, the facility ramped up significantly, and particularly after the agreement that we reached with PNG. That was a really important agreement, as I said. It was the fundamental agreement which took Australia off the table, and it's the point, the line in the sand, beyond which we've stopped seeing a loss of life at sea. But it required, obviously, a whole lot of work to be done at Manus, and we were constantly engaged in that. But the critical issue in terms of the government's own performance here is this, that from the moment they were sworn in, they dropped the ball in relation to PNG, and the Cornell report makes that abundantly clear. We had a situation where the minister did not have a meeting with his counterpart in PNG about the fundamental question of resettling people in PNG until after the events in February, until after those events. We had him warned in October by Lieutenant General Angus Campbell around the question of fencing. We had a letter from G4S, the main contractor, in February giving the same warning, but also making it explicitly clear that they believe there to be an imminent danger of violent protest on the facility, and we are still none the wiser as to what actions the minister took in response to the warnings that he received personally. All of this speaks of a minister who dropped the ball in relation to the facility at Manus Island. So that is what we need to take from the report yesterday. What would we do? Well, the first thing we would do is make sure that Manus Island and Nauru were operating in a manner which provides safe, humane and dignified accommodation to those people who are within those facilities. We would make sure that the offshore processing system that we were running was one that was humane and dignified. And that's a very important point to make. But it's also important to make this point also. Were Labor to form government at the next election, we would keep offshore processing in place. We would, because it is the single most effective deterrent in seeing people not risk their lives at sea, and we cannot, from a position of compassion, abide a situation where we are seeing that tragic loss of life at sea on our borders.
If I could just ask a follow-up question to that. I mean, that last point you made about ensuring that Manus Island was safe, humane and dignified was a point you made in your speech as well. And if one reads the Cornell report, one might wonder, yes, certainly it could be made safer, but given the exchanges that were described in terms of what occurred there between the two cultures, if you like, do you really believe you can make it humane and dignified? Because the suggestion seems to be that would be very hard to achieve.
I think it is possible to do that. And you see facilities which provide asylum seekers, refugees, refuge around the world in all sorts of different circumstances where one culture is living in the midst of another. Of course it can happen. And I'd also make this point about Manus Island, knowing a number of Manusians personally. This is actually a peaceful place, and there is a lot of distress, I know, on the part of Manusians about the way in which they have been portrayed in the Australian media around all of this. It is a peaceful place. But you are going to have issues within any facility where people have a sense that the wheels are not turning, where processing is not happening, and where their time within those facilities is indefinite. And that is the fundamental problem which the Cornell report itself identifies as being in place as a cause of what occurred in February. Which is why I go back to the point, we saw Minister Morrison drop the ball on this issue. Not a single meeting around the question of resettlement with his PNG counterpart until after the events in February. Like, that is the damning fact. And that's, I think, if you could remedy that and ensure that there was a sense of progress of action, that people knew that their situation was being determined, of course a facility of this kind can be run in a way which is dignified and humane.
I'll go back to the floor now for a question from James Glenday.
James Glenday from the ABC. Mr Marles, thanks for your address today. Just on that topic of dignified and respectful, do you think it's acceptable to hold people on ships at any time? And on another topic, some of your Senate colleagues have been asking about the appropriateness of Transfield getting a contract on Manus Island when its chairman is Tony Shepherd. What exactly are they trying to insinuate? Do they think there's some sort of dodgy deal here?
The first part of your question. It is very unclear what is happening on the high seas. And let me make this point around the question of secrecy which has been put in place. I and we in Labor do not accept that the secrecy which Scott Morrison has put in place is in any respect a measure which goes to the operational effectiveness of what is being attempted out there. It is nothing other than a media strategy. That's what it is. But the problem with the media strategy is that it is denying our armed forces, our customs officials, our public servants the ability to properly explain what they're doing and, in circumstances where allegations are made, to defend their actions. I think there are real questions posed by the idea that people have been held on vessels out on the high seas. We don't know that that's what has occurred, but were that to be the case, I think there are real issues around that. But before going to that, I mean, the fundamental point is the government actually needs to explain what it's doing so it can answer those questions. In terms of Transfield, there's a simple point to make here. The contract to run our offshore processing is a billions of dollars contract. It is a massive piece of work. You would want to ensure that all the appropriate procurement conditions occurred in relation to the handing out of any of those contracts. And I think ensuring that that's what occurred is all the question that's being asked.
Stephanie Ballard.
Hello, Stephanie Ballard from The Australian. You've made clear Labor will retain offshore processing. Do you accept any part of the Coalition's argument that boat turnbacks have contributed to stopping the flow of asylum seeker boats?
Well, the principal measure, which has seen a reduction in the flow of asylum seekers, is the PNG arrangement. That's the issue which has seen 90% of the reduction occur. And as I said in my speech proper, the government sometimes argues that a 2-week period is picked out here. The reality is, if you look at the graph from 19 July right through till the middle of December, we see those numbers being very unchanged at a rate of 10% of what they had previously been. So the critical issue here has been the offshore processing. It is hard to answer the question fully in circumstances where we do not know what is happening on our high seas. In specific answer to the question in relation to turnarounds. But I guess the point that we would simply make is this: whatever solution that is arrived at can't be one which is just happening by virtue of a success last month or this month. It needs to survive this year and next year. And in doing that, it has to be an arrangement which is one that is based on cooperation with Indonesia. And I can't for the life of me see how that is going to occur in circumstances where Indonesia have made their views on this issue very plain. The reality is that the turnbacks have occurred in the context of a relationship with Indonesia which has been suspended. Now, no one wants that relationship to continue in that state. There is a huge interest for both countries to re-engage and normalise those relations. The question about the efficacy of turnbacks has to be judged in the context of a normalised relationship with Indonesia.
A question now from Peter Phillips.
Mr Marles, Peter Phillips, Director of the National Press Club. Welcome to the club and thank you for your address. In your address you've said, inter alia, Central to our position will be a continued support for offshore processing and the PNG arrangement. Can you give us some insight into opposition thinking and opposition policy formulation in relation to those offshore countries, offshore settlement areas, processing areas, which are acceptable and which are not acceptable? Where's the cut-off point?
Yeah.
What informs policy? Malaysia, tick. Cambodia, cross.
Yeah.
What are the criteria, apart from the basic of preventing drownings by asylum seekers?
Yeah, it's a good question. And obviously, you know, the starting point is we do this to save lives at sea. But in terms of what criteria we use, I think the answer to that is that it needs to be based on the rights, if you like, and the conditions which will be applied to the asylum seekers concerned. In other words, looking at this from the perspective of the asylum seeker and making sure that whatever arrangements are put in place safeguard those people's rights, provide them safe refuge, because ultimately that's the basis upon which we meet our obligations under the Refugee Convention. And so the question will obviously arise if Cambodia, for example, does take on a life, but you know, we don't know that yet because we're not hearing anything from our own government about what they're doing there. But the question will need to arise around what safeguards are going to be put in place or are proposed, what are the conditions under which asylum seekers would go to Cambodia if that's what's being negotiated. That is the basis upon which an assessment has to be made. And so, if you like, it's about the asylum seekers rather than the country. Now, the two things are clearly connected, but the focus is on the rights and the safety and the refuge which is provided to those people who are asylum seekers and are seeking refuge.
Ken Randall.
Mr Marles, Ken Randall from Ascent here. ABC News today has been running an interview with the PNG Member of Parliament for the Manus Island area, saying that there's virtually no prospect of people being resettled in Papua New Guinea because it would have to be on public land, of which there is almost none. It's all held by community and clan groups, and that most of those people will finish up in Cambodia. Do you have any thoughts about that? And I'll just add a couple of other points. What do you think about the prospect of merging the immigration and border protection functions with customs and perhaps others into one big department with a big important name?
Well, perhaps if I deal with the second first. We've made it clear that the proposition of an Australian border force having one badge that meets you at the border has some merit in it. It was something that Jason Clare, as Minister, articulated when Labor was in government. We are keen to understand what the implications will mean in terms of staffing within such a force, particularly given that we have just seen a budget which has slashed the public service. So, but with that concern in mind, we think there is merit in the concept of having an Australian border force. Now, there is a debate which is going on today in relation to quarantine, and I think that is a separate issue, and you would want to make sure that our quarantine agency is one which is able to conduct its functions fully, and that those functions don't get lost in whatever arrangements that you have in place. In terms of the first part of your question, it is possible, in my view, to have people resettled in PNG. PNG is a country of 7 million people. PNG is a country with a growing economy, and there is significant economic opportunity. I know it's not the same, but to put it in some kind of context, there are actually thousands of Australians who have pursued their fortunes in PNG other than in Australia. And so I don't think it is right to say that there is no prospect of resettling hundreds, which is likely what it would be, people in PNG. It needs to be worked through, though, very carefully. Where those people would be resettled, obviously a matter for the PNG government, but which would be supported by the Australian government. How they would be resettled, the kind of support they would be given. You know, all of these are questions that you would expect would be being discussed between our government and the government of Papua New Guinea. And they're detailed and they're voluminous. And so it's with that we have a real concern that none of those questions were asked and none of those discussions happened until after we saw the tragedy in February. It was only then that we saw Scott Morrison scuttle off to Port Moresby to begin a dialogue with his counterpart about the central question of resettlement. So it is a possible thing to do, in my view, knowing PNG pretty well. But it is going to take some work. And of course, from PNG's point of view, this is the first time that they have, if you like, a humanitarian program where they would be settling people in their own country. So there is a process of needing to work this through with the PNG government, which only heightens the need to have engaged with PNG from day one, which this government did not do.
We have a number of journalism students from the University of Canberra Press Club with us today, and one of their number, James Kent, has the next question.
Yep, James Kent, UC Press Club. You just described unlimited detention as a fundamental reason behind the trouble on Manus Island. Does this mean that you would be open to the idea of capping detention time?
Well, what matters is that there is a process and that people can see a light at the end of the tunnel, that they see that their process is being assessed and that their status is being determined. And nothing will give rise to a growth in tension more than a situation where people feel that they are in limbo and nothing is happening. And that is what was persisting at the Manus Island detention facility, and that is what the Cornell report tells us as it was released yesterday. So I think it is really important that people are processed and dealt with in a timely manner. I think it's difficult to put a number on it. Because the circumstances of people's processing can vary significantly depending on what their personal history and their personal stories are. But there needs to be action and it needs to be done in a timely manner. And the fact that we did not see that happen in PNG, I think goes to the heart of what occurred in February.
Go back now for a question from John Kerrin.
Cheers. Mr Marles, do you believe that the former Labor government should accept any responsibility for what happened here, given that Mr Cornell pointed to the policy change in July by Kevin Rudd as a contributing factor? In your opinion, should the inaction by the Minister mean that he stands aside from his portfolio now? And a third thing, are you concerned about how the criminal investigation into this might go in Papua New Guinea?
Well, the criminal investigation ultimately is a matter for PNG, and it is a good thing that the information that's been gained through the Cornell report process has been provided to the PNG authorities, and I would expect that they would move in relation to this. As to whether or not Scott Morrison should stand aside, that ultimately is a matter for the Prime Minister and his Cabinet, and I'm not going to comment on that. The first part of your question was... Should
you take some...
in terms of taking responsibility, what we... The Cornell report identifies the policy decision that was taken by Labor on the 19th of July last year. That was the right decision to take. That was a successful decision that was taken. It was successful because we have not seen anyone lose their life at sea since the 19th of July last year, which is unambiguously a good thing. But it was also a decision which implied a whole lot of work needed to be done and that there would be significantly more numbers going to Manus, and that's what we were in the process of doing in the lead up to the election. Had we been re-elected, it would have continued with the same intensity that persisted prior to the election. But what we see from the moment that this government was sworn in is things just stop. You know, there's a gap in the timeline, and it's that gap in the timeline which, in our view, and which the Cornell report makes really clear, gave rise to the circumstances that occurred in February of this year.
Sarah White.
Hi. Going back to the resettlement of PNG, so we've seen the riots happen at the moment in February. There's a lot of racial tension. There's a lot of really religious tension going on, particularly between locals and detainees who are Iranian and very hot-headed. This is what the Cornell report was saying. I mean, in 6 months' time, when they're resettled, they've been settled in the houses in Longgrau, and there's a huge riot and 50 people die. Whose responsibility is that going to be? And this is just a hypothetical question, of course, but you know, you could see that there's a lot of violence kind of brewing and there's a lot of tension happening, and that's just in the centre. When they are actually resettled in Papua New Guinea, how do you see that playing out, and should Australia be responsible if violence does occur?
Well, obviously I won't go into the specific of the hypothetical. The resettlement of people in PNG is something which will be led by PNG, but it will be done in cooperation with Australia. And to suggest that Australia has no part in this is obviously wrong. I mean, it's just actually wrong, in fact. For the resettlement process to be successful within PNG, it is going to require a high degree of cooperation between the Australian government and the Papua New Guinean government, and the agreement that was reached last year provided for the Australian government to be financially supportive of the work that the PNG government does in that resettlement. But I also would make the point that PNG is a big country. There is a mosque in Port Moresby. I mean, there are various estimates as to the size of Port Moresby, but it's probably a city nearing 1 million people, maybe slightly less. And it is actually now pretty multicultural. There is a significant mining industry within the country, and there are people from literally all around the world participating in that. So I do actually think that you can imagine resettlement happening successfully within PNG, and many of the asylum seekers, as I've been advised, have a whole lot of skills which could be put to use in PNG. But it's only going to happen if there is active involvement on the part of the Australian government in discussion with the PNG government. And I guess the final point of your question is that if that is what is required, then a failure in that respect is obviously a responsibility, or can be put at the feet of the Australian government.
James Linday.
Me again, Mr. Marles. A big picture question, if I can. Many of your colleagues will say privately that anytime there's a riot, anytime there's an asylum seeker boat arrives, it's not good for Labor. And they'd rather see that you make yourself a very small target and don't talk about this for the next 3 years. Do you think that's a possibility? Can Labor, or do you want Labor to not really make a very big issue on asylum seekers over the next couple of years?
Let's put aside the politics and Labor for a moment. Fundamentally, this has been a really terrible debate for the country. You only need to look at my Twitter feed, literally, to get a sense of how terrible this debate has been. There is a huge chasm between people on both sides. And for me, something of a vignette of that debate as I've witnessed it over the last few months is that really obvious statements. The fact that Manus Island, the facility, should provide humane, dignified and safe accommodation. That's not a hard thing to say, and yet we can't see the Minister for Immigration saying those words. By the same token, the fact that we have seen no one die at sea since the 19th of July last year is an unambiguously good thing. But there are many on the other side of the debate who find it hard to concede or to acknowledge that fact. And to me, those are examples of how skewed and fraught and polarised this debate has become. We need to resolve this debate in the interests of the country. Put aside Labor. We need to resolve it in the interests of the country. And to do that, I think we actively need to resolve it. And I actually think what is in the interests of Labor and in the interests of the resolution of this debate is that we do actually talk about the values which drive us in doing that. That's why I've spoken a lot today about referencing what we do through compassion, through fairness, through generosity, ensuring that whatever we do as a country, we don't harm people as a form of deterrence. These, I think, ought to be the guiding principles which of themselves are simple to say, but should be therefore applied to a complex set of circumstances. And I do think that if we're going to resolve this debate, it needs to be actively resolved. So you're not going to see from me a sense of fear about talking about this issue. I think from the interests of the country, we need to talk about it. And I think that and I think it's important that in doing so, we act from a base of values and not so much from politics.
Stephanie Ballard.
Looking beyond what you call the scoreboard, and given Labor's opposition to TPVs, what's your solution for dealing with the thousands and thousands of people in the community on community bridging visas without work rights?
Well, it's in a sense simple. It'll take some time, but what we need to be doing is assessing all of those people, and if they are found to be genuine refugees, and they should form part of our humanitarian program and resettled in Australia and put on a path to citizenship. And if they are not, then they should be facilitated in their travel back to their home country. That's actually how you deal with that number of people. What we're going to see if the government is successful in putting in place TPVs is not only a regime which will be really cruel at the end of the day for those people. I mean, what it means is when you're on a TPV of a limited duration of years, any decision you take, be it studying, be it buying a house, be it falling in love, any decision you take which goes beyond a few years is a decision which you are unable to entertain whilst you are on a temporary protection visa. And that means that those people are in a very uncertain situation. They are in limbo. But more to the point, as the proposition has been put by the Minister, there will never be an opportunity for them to be given a permanent visa. That was a different situation to what persisted at the end of the Howard government. And they will be reviewed on a periodic basis so that this issue is never resolved. Now, for some of those people, the circumstances of their staying here won't change throughout their lives. And yet, you know, if Minister Morrison is to have his way, those people will live out their lives in Australia on a rolling TPV. You know, that does not deal with this issue, and it does not put it behind us. So, you know, our view is you go through all of the people, you assess them. If they're genuine refugees, you put them through on the humanitarian program, and if they're not, you facilitate their travel back home.
Can you genuinely see a pathway to bipartisanship on this whole issue or not?
Look,
I mean, it's easy to sit in opposition and say we should do this. Government's got control. I mean, you've been very critical, obviously, of the government's policy and Mr Morrison. I mean, it just doesn't seem to me that the situation, the potential is there, certainly not in the immediate future.
I actually do have hope about this. There are a couple of points at which the stars have aligned, not by anything I've done, but they have aligned such that I think there is hope. The first is that both the major parties now are actively working to see an end to the flow of asylum seeker vessels coming from Java and Sri Lanka to Christmas Island. Now, I think we get to that position via very different roads, I think that is a position on the part of the government which has been pursued down a very politically opportunistic path, and from our point, it actually has been a values base of wanting to see an end to a tragedy which has led us to the position that we now pursue. But that said, we are in the same position. So that's the first point. The second point is that for the first time, you now have, since the election, a government and an opposition which want this to be resolved in their own interest, if you like. I mean, the government seeks it to be resolved in terms of fulfilling a promise, but we also want it resolved in terms of moving beyond a debate which we see as having been very damaging to the country. Now, that was not a circumstance which persisted at all during our time in government. Whilst ostensibly we both had a position of wanting to see an end to asylum seeker vessels, we all know that what we had in the Liberal opposition was an opposition that was doing everything it could to wreck every attempt we made to resolve this issue. That is not the situation now. And so we do have a situation where the issue can be resolved, in my view. There is real hope about that, and that there is an ability to reach bipartisanship about the need to resolve it. And I think we can move beyond it. But I also think you won't move beyond it, and Labor won't move beyond it unless we make it clear, which we are doing, about what it is that we stand for within this debate. And that's why I think the focus on values needs to be so strong.
Go to Marles Riley now. But James Kent, did you want another question, did I say? Oh, not now, but did you want one? I'll come back to you if
Thank you for your speech today, Mr Marles. I'll just follow on from Laurie's question. I mean, obviously, the road to bipartisanship's difficult. I'm just wondering how your personal relationship is with Scott Morrison. Is it something you could have a beer at the bar at the press club, or even sit down and have dinner together and talk about things? Sometimes it's relationships between people that make great headways in public policy. And I have a second question, if I may.
Well, the answer to that question is yes on all counts. I've known Scott a long time. We're both class of 2007. We share interests in the region. We both understand that we're on a field of contest. We both understand that we have a job to do, but at a personal level, I get on well with Scott Morrison. But I also agree with the observation that you make. I think personal relationships in this arena do matter. There are going to be times where it doesn't matter what you feel in relation to somebody personally, the circumstances are such that a contest needs to be played out. But there is a good relationship that I have with the Minister. That said, I come back to my previous answer. I think more important than that is the fact that there is an alignment of stars, I believe now, which does allow for us to, as a country, to move beyond that debate. And I think all of us need to be committed to doing that, and a bipartisanship in some respects, in some areas, is going to be a part of that. And I made that clear in my speech proper. It's a matter of doing that, though, without giving the government a blank cheque, and we're not doing that either, as is clear from my speech. There is much that we will hold the government to account for.
Nice.
My second question is sort of an indulgence on this security issue. I'm just interested on your views about the parliamentary security and whether you support it, and whether our journalists should have to go through it and not the members of parliament, their staffers and families and so forth. I'm wondering whether that's sending some wrong messages about security of the primary building in this great capital.
Look, I must say this issue hasn't been discussed in any Labor Party forum, so I'm freelancing at this point. But I don't like it. I don't like it. I mean, I hadn't thought much about it until coming here this week. But there's a lot of people who work in that building. We do need to feel safe in what we do. The September 11 did change the world, and there are threats out there. And by and large, I think that the Parliament House is a fantastic building to work in, and it serves our nation really well. And one of the wonderful things about it is that it is and having seen quite a lot of Parliament Houses around the world, it is not just a place of two chambers. It is in effect a kind of convention centre as well. It's part of the genius of it, I think, and it means that there are often people in the building who get to interact with us, which is great for those people. It's really good for us. But what makes all of that work and gives us a sense of confidence about it working is a proper security system, and I don't like it.
Go back to James Kent.
So you just shot down the idea of a cap on detention time for refugees. Exactly what would you be doing different to the coalition to imbue the people on Manus Island with a sense of progress if it's not capping detention time?
Oh, well, I think it is cutting detention time. Don't get me wrong. I think it is cutting... Oh, sorry, capping. Well, I think it would be cutting detention time by making sure that people are being processed efficiently and that they are being resettled. What we would do differently, and what we would have done differently, is we would have engaged with PNG the day after the election had we won it in September of last year, and I genuinely believe we would have been in a position where processing would have been occurring within this facility and people would have been resettled in PNG well before now. And that would have given everyone a sense that there was a process going on, there was progress being made, they could see the person next to them having their claim determined, and they would know that their turn was coming. So that's what we would have done differently, and what I think needs also to happen in relation to those people who are here. Having efficient and quick and timely processing is a really important ingredient in making the system work, and in identifying that, your question is right. I think capping, putting a time limit on it, is hard because people's circumstances can vary so much, but the general thrust of needing to quicken it up, we completely agree with that.
I think we'll finish on that note. Would you please thank the members? Shadow Minister, I should say.